Okay, it looks like our numbers are slowing down for people coming into the room. Good evening to you all. My name is Jeff Barsnell. I am a Weston resident. I'm a dad. I'm a member of MetroWest Climate Solutions Steering Committee, and I am your moderator for tonight's program. I am joined by my fellow board member, Tom Walker, who has been instrumental in organizing tonight's program and presentation. MetroWest Climate Solutions' mission is to inspire sustainable, resilient, and equitable communities and to host timely and relevant programs that encourage people and organizations to get involved in bringing about solutions and realistically facing the climate crisis. MCS is a local partnership of organizations and congregations, including First Parish in Wayland, First Parish Church in Weston, First Parish in Lincoln, First Parish in Framingham, Energize Wayland, Sustainable Western Action Group, and a growing list of communities and individuals. Be in touch or contact us to get involved. Tonight's program is part one in a short series of on climate change and New England. It will feature reports on the latest data on the climate science for Massachusetts. And then will be followed by a second part, which will be on Wednesday, June 5th, with a program on water and sea level rise that will feature Professor Steve Young from Salem State University. Information on all of our past and our present programs can be found at our website, www.metrowestclimatesolutions.org. Tonight's program is entitled, "We May Need a Bigger Boat. Is Massachusetts Ready for Climate Change?" What should the Commonwealth be doing to prepare for the predicted impacts of climate change? Well, to answer this question, we're delighted to have Edwin Sumargo, a climate scientist who is part of the climate team at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, the EEA. This group includes climate hazards, mitigation, adaptation, and policy experts, as well as staff to support local communities in their adaptation and preparation efforts around the state. Dr. Sumargo will discuss the latest climate projections and how his group supports state agencies and municipalities as they prepare for the inevitable challenges and changes we all will be experiencing in the coming years and decades. Dr. Sumargo is a climate scientist in the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. He has over 8 years of experience in geospatial and statistical data analyses, with domain expertise in meteorology, climatology, and hydrology. Before coming to the EEA in 2023, he was a researcher at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and he earned his PhD in climate science from the University of California, San Diego. Tonight's program will include a slideshow presentation followed by a time for questions and discussions moderated and facilitated by Tom Walker. And now we welcome Edwin Sumargo to MetroWest Climate Solutions. Thank you for being here tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Tom, for organizing this event. And hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. So this evening, I will be sharing some of the latest climate projections, including hazards and impacts that we will face in Massachusetts. So now I will share my screen. Okay, final check. Everyone can see my screen? Perfect. Yeah, so thanks again, everyone. So basically tonight, my talk is titled, "Is Massachusetts Ready for Climate Change?" So as Jeff has featured earlier, I will be talking about the projections and how that relates to the hazards that we are feeling and we are going to feel in the future and impacts that is expected for the Commonwealth. And I will also feature some of the initiatives and programs that the state has already started to do in order to empower us all to face the climate change. So I don't need to introduce myself much anymore. I'm Edwin Sumargo, but basically I want to acknowledge 2 of my teammates. One is Marco Mansfield, who is a coastal hazard specialist. So if you have any questions about sea level rise and coastal flooding, she's the person and then also Caitlin Spence, who is non-coastal hazard specialist and hydrologist. So if you have questions about, let's say, floodings, so she will be the go-to person. So enough with ourselves, because this is not the main part of the talk, but then here is the outline of the talk. I just introduced myself and my team. And basically, when I'm going to talk about the climate projections, including hazards and impacts, they will be based on the relatively recent publications of our climate reports. One is the climate change assessment published back in 2022, which focuses on the projections and hazards and impacts and actions that the Commonwealth is taking. So this assessment eventually also informed the Resilient Mass Plan in 2023. So basically, it reiterates some of the findings in climate change assessment, but it focuses more on the progress that we have made and also the sets of action that the Commonwealth is going to take in the coming years and decades. So these two will be the main contents of the talk, my talk today. But I will also feature some of the resources that, some examples of the resources that we have in the state, including some initiative and then the program that has been going on for a while, like the so-called Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness. So from now on, if I say MVP, I'm referring to them. And also finally, the climate action campaign that was more recently started as well. So first, now we are going into the climate change assessment that was published in 2022. So what is this? This is basically an effort that took many of us within the states that consists of different experts in different areas, including climate science and also particular hazards, for example, like how climate change is going to change the state of the extreme heat that we will face and what kind of impacts that we will see in the future, ecosystem changes, for example, or impacts on economy and health as well. So it is a consortium of people coming together to assemble this report. So I don't want to go into the details of this individual colors here, but basically they represent different volumes from executive summary on the left. In the middle is the statewide report, which focuses on a lot of the content that I will be presenting today. And the third one is more towards the regional outlook of that. So this assessment it breaks down into different sectors that we were looking at. One is human and health safety, infrastructure, natural environment, economy, and governance. And all of the projections and the assessment that were done there, we used the highest emission scenario, also known as the representative concentration pathway, RCP 8.5. So if you want more details, you can also take a look at this. You can always find it through Google or through the link below when the presentation slide is shared later. So from now on, I will also talk about some of the most urgent impacts and also parts that the state is pursuing as a part of the actions on climate. And if I talk about some of the most urgent priorities, it is basically those that are based on this metric that were developed during when we were assembling this report. So one for sure is that the magnitude of consequence, what kind of consequence we will see from certain hazards and impacts, for example, and also how disproportionate it is going to affect some parts of the population versus the other, some adaptation gap, if it is severe or not, that will make up into this metric of whether it is a low to or high priority. This does not mean that if it is ranked as a low priority, then we will ignore it. It's just that what will be the most concentrated and priority efforts that we will take as an action in the coming time as well. So these are some of the examples of the top priorities. A lot of them, again, I'm not going to go into details and read them one by one, but basically that there are some of the that we have identified in this effort. according to these different sectors as well. And as I'm presenting some of the projections and going into the impacts, I will also pull out some of these elements here in our time, in our limited time, to give you some examples about what kind of impacts that we're expecting, and then how it is related to this metrics here. So now, when we are talking about climate change, or commonly also known as global warming, the most obvious aspect to it is that the temperature is going to increase. This is true everywhere throughout the globe, and also in Massachusetts here. So according to the the latest study that's also featured in this report, we know that for Massachusetts, since the beginning of the 20th century, we have seen an increase of 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit in average temperature. So this includes all seasons, all days or nights. So this is just basically annual average. So we are looking towards the future. The example that was featured in the report was also towards the year 2050, for example. The expected annual average temperature increase will be between 5.9 and 7.9 degrees Fahrenheit. So, but when we are talking about temperature, it is inevitable that we are also talking about humidity. And why? If you tune in, for example, to weather reports or weather channel or whatever it is, you will see that they will also talk about how is it going to feel like, or if there is going to be like a heat index, for example. But again, I'm not going to much into detail on that. But basically, with the same temperature, the higher the humidity, the harder it is for the body to cool down. So that's why we will feel like, even though maybe the temperature is 90 degrees, we will feel like it is 100 degrees, for example. But where am I going with this? Basically, when the study was going on, when we are looking towards the future, the temperatures rising, and then also the humidity may be rising, because the warmer it is, the more evapotranspiration there is, the more water vapor there is in the air. So in the future, now a hot summer day in Massachusetts, let's say here, as you can see on the graph on the right-hand side, by 2050, a hot summer day will feel like that, typically in the current day Maryland. By the end of the century, it will feel like in Georgia. So again, now that we are increasing day, when we are talking about hazards, we typically think about like the heat waves or extreme heat and how it is going to affect us. Some people are more sensitive than others as well. Typically, elderly people and infants. We also want to look at, so what is the expected change now in the number of high heat days. So this report took an example from the number of days that's above 90 degrees Fahrenheit per year, the change in the number of days per year. So according to the study, we are expecting that there will be approximately 23 up to 29 high heat days per year by 2050. And then with these changes, there is also, we can see on the right-hand side as well, the black also represented by a circle that it is the inland portion of the state, and then the triangle or the gray color represents the more coastal area of the state. And we see that there will be also asymmetry where the warming will be faster. That is, the inland area will warm faster than the coastal part. And the statistics also says that about 25 to 30% more increase in high days in inland parts compared to the coastal side. So now, when we are talking about impact, one of the highest impact, I think everyone is aware of this, is that how is it going to affect our health? And one metric that was presented was the additional premature deaths associated with this extreme heat. So this table shows for different regions in assessment, from the Berkshire and Hill towns, including also the Boston area, different Cape and islands as well, for different projection decades from 2030, 2050, 2070, and 2090. One thing for sure that we see here immediately that jumps out is that aside from the fact that the additional premature deaths will keep increasing with the decades. The coastal areas will see relatively more additional premature deaths. And there are many factors that go into this. For one thing is that that I know is that coastal areas will typically has fewer homes with air conditioning, for example, and also this closer to coastal area like the eastern inland and Boston harbors are also more densely populated and have higher concentration of urban areas. And these urban areas also typically have more environmental justice communities and people who have less access to facilities like air conditioning and so on, to help them to adapt to the changing climate, and then the extreme heat as well. So typically, I really hate to relate this the human health and potential deaths to the dollar amount, but then the report also features that in terms of economic cost that it will incur as can be as large as $6 billion by the end of the century. So somewhere closer to that, I'm not going to go as much into details on this one, but basically because of many more days with high heat, more than 90 degrees Fahrenheit, there will be also expected loss of productivity and also high stress-related health issues that workers will face because of this. So this number is it is said that a loss of equivalent of about 1,000 full-time employees will be expected due to this increase in the number of high heat days. So what does it mean? One of the examples that I was recently talking with my colleagues is that one example is the workers that typically have to work outdoors. So one example is from the MBTA. We know that from a lot of their technicians and also their machinists also work in this situation. So they will typically they will face a lot of the risk from this high heat related incidents and health issues as well. And aside from the health issue, there are also disruptions that's going to happen in the services. So in this example that I'm showing here, some of the equipments are also sensitive to heat, that they may face more number of failures in the future. And of course that the railroad tracks will also more easily buckle in the future because of this heat. So now we move on a little bit towards the precipitation, and this is another fundamental driver of climate change that we are talking aside from the temperature. So we are also interested in how the precipitation pattern will be affected in the future. So for one thing, for sure, with the increasing temperature, we will see more rain than snow. But we also want to know how much is it going to change at all in terms of the number of rainfall events and also how much rainfall we will get in the future. So if we see the graph on the right, one is on the annual scale, what we will see across the year as well as in the summer and winter. For annual and summertime, the changes that we will see are going to be relatively small. That doesn't mean that there will be no changes or it's negligible. It's just that it is not going to be as much as we will see in the winter here. So if you see on the bottom right-hand side there, the magnitude of the change is much more significant than we will see in other seasons. So as large as in the order of close to 40% changes compared to the climatology. And by climatology here, when they are comparing the average between the mid-20th century until very recently. So what does this mean? So if we have increased precipitations in the winter time, we will, I think one figure that we can relate more closely is that what just happened this past winter. We have a lot of rainfall events and flooding issues everywhere, and also basement being flooded everywhere in the state as well. So that was a preview about what is going to happen in the future if we have increased precipitation. So the risk of flooding is expected to be also going to increase. So there's also a bit of changes that can be expected in other seasons. For example, in the summer, although there are also variability in terms of not just by how much that we are projecting there, comparing one model to another, but mainly also the where exactly we will going to see increase versus decrease in terms of precipitations in the summertime. But overall, despite this variability, what is going to happen is that they find that there will be an increase in the number of consecutive dry days. And why is that significant? Because the number of consecutive dry days is typically what going to affect the crops and agriculture as well, for example, and also that is going to affect the drought development. So this is a lot of information here. I'm not I'm not going to into the technical details here, but basically what this is showing is that for engineers out there, typically when we are building structures and trying to design that to endure weather or climate hazards, you care about like a 24-hour design storm, for example. That is how much rainfall is expected within the span of 24 hours. So if we are talking about that, the example that that is shown here is that let's take about the coastal area on the bottom right. So if we're talking about an event that is big enough to make it as being called a 10-year event, or something that's typically occur on average only once in 10 years, we are talking about 24-hour total rainfall of about 2.5, closer to 3 inches. In the future, when we are talking about this magnitude of event, that is 10-year event, it is going to keep increasing with time. And this is based on the fact that when we have a warmer climate, again, we expect more evapotranspiration and therefore more moisture in the air. And this moisture is what provides fuel for the storm development. So with this, again, if we are looking at the impact angle, it is inevitable that we are also asking about, okay, but then what does it mean in terms of us? And there will be a different impacts that we will see here on the ground, depending on where you are, especially when you're talking about flooding. So this is one of the recent event last year. What is going to happen as a result of these changes? So we know that there are a lot of chatters last year with regards to what happens in Leominster, for example, with flooding, and then as a result, there's also some landslide and so on. But then what I'm trying to focus here is the changes in precipitation and flooding. So in this example, on the left-hand side, they talk about a 200-year event. So when we were looking at a data set that's currently established according to the historical climate, like the NOAA Atlas 14, for example. And we see what a 200-year event mean for Leominster. And then we see in the projection, depending again exactly where in the area, whether it's in Leominster or in the state in general, it will become more frequent in the future. So what is considered extreme now, it will become more normal in the future. So in this case, 50 up to 100-year event by 2050. So this is one of the examples that was also showcased in the report with the increased precipitation and also increased risk of flooding. There's also an expected increase in the number of residential damages in the future. So in the figure on the right-hand side, we see from the bright brown colors there. Those are the areas where they expect the greatest changes or the greatest increase in the number of expected damages from increased precipitation and flooding in the future. So we see that some of the examples include along the Connecticut River Valley and to the west of that northern part of the Berkshires, and also pockets of the northeastern and southeastern part of Massachusetts. So there are many impacts areas that we can talk about, including also that's featured in the assessment. But then there are a couple of examples here that I want to highlight. For one, on the left-hand side is actually this is a combination of changes of precipitation and also rising temperature. So we are also expecting that there will be increased number of incidents of harmful algal bloom. And algal blooms typically is can be driven by different factors. One thing is the warmer water temperature. Other aspects include the changes in precipitation. So if in the summertime, for example, in certain areas, there will be expected fewer number of days seeing precipitations, and therefore drier condition, lower stream level and lower lake level, for example. It is much more conducive for the weather to warm the water temperature there, and that's conducive for the growth of the cyanobacteria as well. So, and also if we see an increase in precipitation in some other seasons, that can also accelerate the runoff rate from the precipitation, and then it's also more conducive to transport of nutrients and contaminants to a certain part of the aquatic ecosystem that may also affect how the algal blooms can develop in the future. And on the right-hand side is the changes in the relative suitability of habitat for red maple and eastern white pine. So these are just two examples that will happen, and we see that with this yellow oranges color, the brighter the color is, the greatest the changes is. And this means that in the future, for this example in the Massachusetts, the habitat will be much less suitable for these two species. And by no means this is the most significant impact, because there are some other three species that also that are projected to be completely missing or lost in Massachusetts. So this is the last driver, fundamental driver that I will be talking about today, aside from the temperature and precipitation changes. So we know that sea level rise and by extension also coastal flooding is going to change in the future as a result of warmer climate. And the warmer the temperature is, and whether it is the air also on the ocean temperature, we know that the water is going to expand, and that therefore the sea level will continue to increase with warmer climate. And if the sea level increases in the future, that means that also even with the slightest nudge, for example, from tidal activity, high tides, we will be more vulnerable for tidal floodings related to tidal activities as well. And on the top of that, of course, if we have massive storms, whether it is from hurricane remnants that we have seen in the past, or nor'easter, typically during fall and winter, we will also at a greater risk of coastal flooding. So going back to the basic here in the number, the sea level has risen by over 8 inches since the beginning of the 20th century. And this number actually becomes closer to 11 inches in Boston. There are many aspects as to why this happens. For one thing, also that we have to remember in certain area they can be affected by development, and also some other areas like in Boston that I've heard is that it is also affected by land subsidence that will exacerbates the effect of sea level rise. So, and what does coastal flood can bring us in terms of impact in the future? And one aspect is that for sure, aside from the road washout and disruptions to mobility and transportation because the roads are damaged, in itself, even if the road is not completely damaged, if it is affected by the flooding itself, inundated, and then there will be a massive disruptions in terms of services, and that includes the emergency services. So the figure on the right is showcasing about what type of disruptions and where and how many vehicle hours that is expected during 100-year event, basically a big event in the future with regards to coastal storms and coastal flooding by 2070. And the risk for this type of impacts is also typically higher among some of the sensitive assets, particularly like hospitals, schools, and some underground quarters. So this is just more of a teasers that what is happening recently that we can expect that will be more of a commonplace in the future. On the left-hand side is the some of the floodings that we saw a few years back in near the New England Aquarium. And in the middle is the disruptions in the red line of MPTA because of the flood water associated with coastal storms. And on the right-hand side is near Hull. We can see this is what I was talking about when even if the road is not completely damaged, we see this type of inundation from the coastal floodings. And this is the last impact. I know this is a lot of information that I will feature today, but basically with the sea level rise as well, we expect that some of the low-lying marshes in the area will also be, for one thing, is that here in green is the what they categorize as a high marsh, and then purple as a low marsh, and what is now considered as a high marsh will transition to more towards a low marsh, and then in the future, it is more likely they will get inundated by tidal activities as well as a storm as well. Okay, a lot of information there. But basically, these are some of the take-home points that we can get here. So as the average temperature continue to climb, we also expect that there will be more high heat days in the future. And as a result, we can also expect that there will be additional premature deaths and changes or loss in productivity and ecosystem services. When we are talking about precipitation changes, as I said earlier, there will be increase in precipitation, particularly during the winter seasons, and there will be intensification of the rainfall as well in the future as a result of these changes. Therefore, there will be greater risk of flooding and damaged properties as well. And lastly, the sea level rise with new increase and coastal flood will also become more frequent, and it's going to in turn going to affect the emergency services and how the coastal marshes currently situated, and comparing today and in the future. So now that we have talked about all of these hazards and impacts, what is the state doing? Of course, that we can always say that we are there's a lot to do, and we are working hard trying to address this problem, and this is why the current administration like to talk about the whole government approach. And by that, it means that every department will think about climate resilience angle in every aspects of their work. And definitely there are still a lot of work to do in order for us to be considered climate ready, but it is an ongoing work. And Massachusetts is one of the most aggressive state in the nation that is trying to deal with this problem. So this is again what I briefly mentioned in the beginning, Resilient Mass Plan that was published in 2023. This was informed by the climate change assessment from 2022, and this was actually a rebranding of the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan from 2018, which was a federally concerted effort that followed the FEMA guideline to make us prepared towards climate hazards, climate and weather-related hazards. So with this also that the government identify various actions that we need to take. And remember in the beginning, I also talked about the most urgent impacts, and with that also associated urgent actions that we need to take. So there are in total over 140 actions identified across the secretariats and agencies in the government that we will work not just with each other, but we're also working with municipalities and local communities as well, including environmental justice communities. So these are some of the example. You don't need to read everything on the left-hand side. Basically, this is just the snapshot from the report. But some of the example is that the Health and Human Services is developing new heat flag system to identify extreme heat and earth preparedness among populations. The Department of Conservation and Recreation, if you go to state parks, at times you will see this. Their symbols and DCR. That's who they are. They are also building a lot of facilities to include more shades and cooling structures to ensure that people and users will be more comfortable in using them, to make sure that this is also helping the local communities to adapt to future changes in climate. And lastly, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center and Department of Energy Resources are also helping community to install heat pumps, for example, in school and other government facilities. So this is a little bit of a slot promotion, but basically as a part of that resin mass action, the Office of Climate Science, which I'm a part of, is formed. Basically, our charge is that we are as the in-house to-go people or point of contact for climate science and data-related questions and resources. And we are also working with other agencies to and decision makers as well to make sure that they're informed by the latest climate science and data resources that are available for Massachusetts. So now we are moving towards the ending, where I'm just going to feature some of the initiatives that the state has done so far. One thing is the resilient coast plan. Right now, it's still in its relatively early phase, but basically this is the state, particularly the coastal zone management work is going to work with different agencies as well as local communities to make sure that we know what will be the best solutions for local communities. So they are also identifying like some districts where they have similar conditions and climate, and also to find common solutions to address the problem that these coastal communities are going to face as a result of climate change and sea level rise. And this is the so-called MVP that I called earlier, Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. Basically, they are helping municipalities and towns and cities to prepare for the effects of climate change and to enhance their climate resiliency. And they are also working with them to provide fundings to ensure that they are able to achieve this goal. And this is my last slide. But basically, this is the more recent climate action campaign. Currently, it's still actively under work, but basically this is where you can find tips about what individual residents and communities can do to help prepare and also help mitigate the effects of mitigate climate change. So with that, I would like to conclude my talk.
All right. Thank you, Edwin. That was an amazing amount of information in a short period of time. I think, Jeff, you didn't actually mention that if people have questions, they should be typing them into the Q&A. So I'll say that now. And anyone who has questions, I know some people have already started doing that. Please go ahead and type them in. I will open up the Q&A now. I'd just like to say, to start out, I think, one of the amazing things for the climate assessment from my perspective is, looking at it and hearing the talk tonight, how, interwoven into, all aspects of our life, these climate impacts really are. I mean, their ecological impacts, their impacts to, the infrastructure that we use every day, their human health impacts that affect people at work and at home. There are governmental impacts that Edwin didn't really talk much about that affect revenues that, flow into the government. These impacts are, they're going to be ubiquitous throughout our lives as, we move through the coming decades. And the other thing that struck me is they ramp up quite quickly over the decades and become, really significant if the world doesn't actually end up reducing emissions significantly. And that's kind of another observation that, our emissions in Massachusetts aren't really, a substantial part of the world's emissions. So even if we're, good at reducing our own emissions, we're still going to experience these impacts if, the rest of the world doesn't do a good job of mitigating emissions. So a lot of the actions that Edwin, I think, ends up talking about at the end of his talk are really adaptation responses to this, and they become incredibly important regardless of what happens, at the broader scale. So I think, I think those are all important things. I guess let me start out just by asking
Excuse
one
me.
question.
Tom, could I just interrupt one moment? Edwin,
Sure.
could we ask you to stop sharing your screen?
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Perfect.
I would just like to ask one question to start out, and I know the climate assessment dealt with some environmental justice issues as part of the work there. You allude to it briefly in your presentation. I know from looking at the report that in some areas there are some fairly disproportionate effects. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, that's a really tough subject to discuss because even I would say that it is currently one of our biggest focus when we are trying to not only when we are assessing climate change and the impacts as well, but then when we are trying to address this problem, that's one of the area that we are, if I can say, aggressively try to focus on. Because for as you mentioned, I don't know where you were trying to drive at there, but for example, that one of the questions that I've heard is that not question, but the information that I've heard recently was that in some areas, I don't quite remember where exactly, but then they did not even have a proper drainage system. So that is something that's, I know that at the surface value, it's heart-wrenching, but then at the same time, it is an existential problem that we need to address much sooner than some other issues that we can face with regards to like increased risk of flooding, for example.
Okay, thanks. We've started out with some more technical questions. I think, one is, what's the source of the data you use for the increase in temperatures?
Yeah, so that is, there can be multiple sources, but then the central source, particularly when we are talking about those specific to Massachusetts, like when I showed how much it is going to warm by 2050 in Massachusetts, it is based on the Cornell, one of Cornell's groups that's the data is called stochastic weather generator. So basically, they create the simulations of many weather generations toward the future, and their algorithm is based on the some other more known downscale climate projections called localized constructed analogies.
So is it a Monte Carlo model of some kind that
Yes.
projects a range? Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. And in a similar vein, there's a question about why do you focus on 24-hour precipitation events when it seems like historically some of the worst damage has occurred from multiple storms that occur over the course of, a several-day period. Would that be a better metric in some ways, or?
Yes, I totally agree to that, and that's really good questions. The reason I mentioned the 24-hour is because that is, I'm trying to remember. I'm not an engineer by training, so I'm trying to remember exactly the term. But I think when they're talking about that, it's more like a design storm. When they're trying to design infrastructures, for example, they want to try to understand how much precipitation it can withstand. So typically the way they approach it is by looking at 24-hour precipitation. So, but then I agree to the point where typically, not typically, but a lot of the storms, they are not necessarily going to be exactly 24 hours. Some can be very short duration, but high impacts, like what we have seen in Neominster last year, for example. The total the massive amount of precipitation that they saw only happened over the course of about 6 hours. And then some other systems, some systems came with the back-to-back storms that will, in combination, span over 3 days, for example. So, and then with that, that is going to have a lot of other ramification. So for if this back-to-back storm, after one storm, the ground is going to be wet, the ground is saturated. Next storm comes, and then it is primed for flood generation, and that's how the typical the flood happens.
Okay, that makes sense. That a couple of storms that happened in Maine back in January of this year seemed like a good example of where you had multi-day storms that really did a huge amount of damage on the coast. A few other questions here that are coming in. Do you have any thoughts on how climate change is going to affect the insurance industry?
Oh, yeah, that's
Is
well,
that
first of all, I'm
something
not,
your office is concerned about at all, or?
yeah. For one thing, I'm not qualified to answer that. But then I know that is something that's currently a hot button topic and has been brought up a lot, whether talking to other colleagues or in conferences. So I know that if you read news, not just in Massachusetts, but also in other parts of country like California, the insurance rate is going to keep increasing because of the risk that the insurance industry is going to face when they are insuring these homes that is going to face greater risk of flooding, or in California case, for example, wildfire and so on in the future.
Okay. And then we've got another question. Did the assessment consider impacts of climate migration on Massachusetts? For example, will populations from other states that feeling greater impacts from climate change try to move to where temperatures won't increase as much? Do you feel that's an important issue?
That's another great question. I think, yeah, I have to admit I don't remember much on that part, and that's probably because that was not covered enough or should as it should be. So I know that now we have started talking about that, and not just, frankly, it's not just about people from other states, for example, more southern states that's going to see much less inhabitable temperature and situation in the future, but also what happens to people from other countries, and where I know that some parts of it's not just temperature, but also some of the low-lying nations that are going to be significantly affected by sea level rise. They are also going to look towards us, and Massachusetts is probably one of the prime destination for that.
Yeah, no, I think that could be significant. We have a question about in your prioritization chart, you mentioned an adaptation gap. Could you define that and talk about how you use adaptation gaps to prioritize your work?
Yeah, that's something that well, I should go back a little bit here, but basically when they were talking about the adaptation gap is whether looking at whether, let's say, community or certain sector is relatively prepared or less prepared when they're talking about some of the anticipated impacts of climate change. So in terms of how that has some ramifications towards myself, or my team in our work, what we are trying to do is that as we are looking at this, we are working very, sorry, let me go back a little bit. I know that it is natural for anyone, including us, that we are trying to work in silos. So this is where it is important, I think, that we are talking with other teams and those who are working on different aspects of it. For example, that we are working closely with municipal vulnerability preparedness team, so that we are informed by what the municipalities and other end users or their partners, what they are seeing on the ground directly. So that information that we gain through this interaction and engagement with the MVP, the so-called MVP's partners, will help us to see what kind of gap that we still have in terms of adaptation. And then now going back to our charts as a Office of Climate Science, which is responsible for data resources, what types of data that we are still lacking and we need to address to help them better prepare and cover that adaptation gap.
Interesting. Okay. From a big picture perspective, you know, when you look at the entire climate assessment, do you think it's conservative? It seems like a lot of the, you know, UN assessments are often, every time they revise it, things get worse. And, you know, if you look over the years of all the assessments that have been done, it seems like they're always cautious in what they predict. And every time they do a new study, things look worse because they become more convinced that are more willing to release, you know, results based on more analysis that show things are actually going to be worse than they thought in the previous study. Do you think this study is subject to the same kind of bias?
Possibly, although I should also refer back to my earlier, I know that's only a minor part where I mentioned that the ones featured in our climate assessment uses the highest emission scenario. Whereas I cannot speak too much for the UN, which probably are referring towards IPCC, but they also consider multiple scenarios, including the intermediate scenarios. And depending on who uses it, sometimes they like to take in the middle. I will not advise doing something like that, but that's probably one of the reasons. But then another reason is that we have to remember when we are talking about climate change and how that will unfold in our natural system, as well as how it impacts us as a person and so on, is that it is not linear. So by that, I mean, like, you add something by 1 unit, you don't necessarily expect that the consequence also adding only 1 unit. It is going to be, there is like a feedback cycle where basically a non-linear process where it is not going to be 1 by 1 like that. So with that, because of the complexity of the system as well, there is also what is called unknown. So that is another wild card there that's going to keep unfolding in the future that we previously don't know. And it turns out there is such thing that is also affecting our climate system and then impact that we see on the ground.
How often is the state likely to update its climate assessment? Is that on a regular schedule or?
Yes, currently it is on a 5-year schedule. That is, it is going according to the so-called State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan, or SIMCAP, which is that syncs with the national cycle that is consulted by FEMA.
And are there particular issues right now that your office is really focused on trying to dig deeper into, understand better from a climate science perspective?
So there are many issues to that. I think even the ones that we feel like we already understand, like this temperature projection, and as you correctly said, that we still have questions. Is this accurate enough? Is this robust enough? Is it too conservative, for example, or not? And whether the scenarios that we are considering is enough are some of the questions that we are trying to tackle here. And also, just to flesh out some more details, that's why we are also tapping some of the scientists academic communities and researchers to be a part of our science advisory panel. That is to make sure that the team of three, including myself, stays up to date to the latest science and best practices.
Well, it seems like you're doing a lot of good work there, and I think we're probably getting close to the end of our hour here. Are there any final remarks you'd like to put forward to the group here? I think this has been a fascinating talk, and I appreciate your joining us tonight.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for again tuning in. I know that this is a lot of information. Of course, that if you have more specific questions or follow-up, please feel free to reach out to me through Tom or through our group's email, climatescience@mass.gov. So, and we are here definitely as to serve everyone within the state, not just other agencies and teams, but also everyone, to make sure that the actions that are going towards the future is informed by the latest science and data resources.
All right. Jeff, you want to say any final words?
Just thank you, Edwin Sumargo, for being here tonight and offering such a thoroughgoing and substantive presentation. Thank you, Tom, for your very capable Q&A. Our next program will be on Tuesday, May 30th. It will feature a legislative update with Casey Bowers, the Environmental League of Massachusetts Action Fund Director. She leads ELM's lobbying efforts at the State House. As we come to the close of the current legislative session at the end of July, this seems to be a good and opportune time to look at the bills, the pieces of proposed legislation that may actually have a chance of becoming law as it pertains to climate, adaptation, energy efficiency, renewable energy efforts, and the like. That will be on Tuesday, May 30th, and part 2 of our program on climate change in Massachusetts, this time featuring focusing on water and sea level rise, will be that following Wednesday, June 5th. Thank you all for attending tonight. Have a good evening.